250 years ago, a small group of men made a decision that would permanently alter the course of human history. In July of 1776, representatives of 13 American colonies signed a declaration openly challenging the most powerful empire on Earth. In doing so, they began the creation of something entirely new. Today we remember them as the Founding Fathers. Their names are etched into monuments, written into law, and studied in classrooms around the world. But history often remembers men at the moment they became great, and far less often examines the years that shaped them before that greatness arrived. Before George Washington commanded armies, before Benjamin Franklin negotiated with kings, before Thomas Jefferson wrote of liberty, before John Adams defended independence, before Alexander Hamilton built the nation's financial system, and before Samuel Adams stirred rebellion in Boston, they were simply British subjects living ordinary, uncertain lives in colonial America. They were not born revolutionaries, they became them. To understand how the United States was founded, it is worth first understanding the men who built it and the experiences that brought them to that moment. By the middle of the 18th century, the American colonies remained deeply tied to Britain. Most colonists considered themselves loyal subjects of the Crown. They traded under British protection, fought in British wars, and saw their future as part of the empire. Independence was not yet the goal. In truth, few could have imagined it. But over time, experience began to change minds. George Washington was among the first. Born in Virginia in 1732, Washington came from a respectable family, though not among the wealthiest. From an early age, he sought status. He trained as a surveyor, mapping the Virginia frontier and gaining an understanding of land, wealth, and power. Like many ambitious young men in the colonies, Washington admired Britain. He wanted military distinction and social advancement within the empire. That opportunity came during the French and Indian War. As a young officer, Washington fought for Britain against the French and their native allies. The experience shaped him deeply. He saw combat, endured defeat, and learned the realities of command. But perhaps more importantly, he witnessed how British officers treated colonial soldiers. Though they fought for the same cause, they were rarely treated as equals. Colonial officers lacked the rank, prestige, and respect given to their British counterparts. For Washington, this mattered. He was ambitious, proud, and increasingly aware that no matter his accomplishments, he remained in British eyes a colonial. That lesson stayed with him. Benjamin Franklin's path was very different. Born in Boston in 1706, Franklin was the son of a candlemaker. Unlike Washington, he was not born into land or status. His rise would come through skill and intellect. Apprenticed in his brother's print shop, Franklin developed an early love for writing, reading, and debate. At 17, he left Boston and started over in Philadelphia. There, Franklin built himself into one of the most successful men in the colonies. Printer, publisher, inventor, scientist, philosopher. By middle age, Franklin had achieved wealth and international recognition. He admired Britain deeply and spent years in London representing colonial interests. For much of his life, Franklin believed the colonies and Britain could remain united. He was no early radical, but over time, he too began to change. As tensions grew between Parliament and the colonies, Franklin found himself increasingly frustrated. British officials often dismissed colonial concerns outright. In 1774, Franklin was publicly humiliated before the Privy Council in London, accused of dishonesty and disloyalty. For Franklin, the moment was transformative. A man who once sought compromise began to believe independence might be unavoidable. Thomas Jefferson's journey was shaped less by conflict and more by ideas. Born in Virginia in 1743, Jefferson was raised among the planter class and received one of the finest educations available in colonial America. He studied law, history, science, and philosophy. More than any of the major founders, Jefferson was a product of the Enlightenment. He absorbed the writings of John Locke, Francis Bacon, and Isaac Newton. These thinkers shaped his belief that rights were natural, not granted by kings. To Jefferson, government existed to protect liberty, not to define it. Long before independence became reality, Jefferson had already developed a philosophy built on human reason and individual freedom. Yet like many men of his time, his life carried contradiction. He wrote passionately of equality while living in a society built in part on slavery. This contradiction would define much of his legacy. But before he became the author of the Declaration, Jefferson was simply a young lawyer and thinker, studying ideas that would one day help shape a nation. John Adams came to revolution through law. Born in Massachusetts in 1735, Adams was raised in a farming family and educated at Harvard. He became a lawyer and quickly developed a reputation for discipline, intelligence, and stubborn principle. Unlike Franklin or Washington, Adams had little interest in status. His concern was order. Law to Adams was civilization itself. That belief became clear after the Boston Massacre in 1770. When British soldiers fired into a crowd of colonists, tensions exploded. Public anger demanded punishment, yet Adams agreed to defend the British soldiers in court. It was an unpopular decision, but Adams believed justice required fairness, even for enemies. To him, liberty meant nothing without law. As Parliament passed new taxes and restrictions, Adams increasingly saw Britain violating the constitutional rights of Englishmen. He did not rush toward rebellion. He arrived there reluctantly, convinced that legal order itself was under threat. Alexander Hamilton was the outsider. Born in the Caribbean in either 1755 or 1757, Hamilton's early life was marked by hardship. His father abandoned the family. His mother died while he was still young. He grew up poor, with no inheritance and little social standing. Unlike the others, Hamilton had no established place in colonial society, but he possessed extraordinary intelligence. As a clerk on the island of St. Croix, Hamilton witnessed trade, debt, and economic instability firsthand. These experiences shaped his views on finance and government. After writing an account of a hurricane that devastated the island, local leaders were so impressed that they funded his education in America. Hamilton arrived in New York as a young man with little but talent. For him, America represented opportunity. Not inherited opportunity, but earned opportunity. That belief would shape everything he did. And then there was Samuel Adams. If Washington became the sword of the Revolution, Samuel Adams became its voice. Born in Boston in 1722, Adams spent much of his early life in relative obscurity. He failed in business and struggled financially. But where he lacked commercial success, he possessed political conviction. More than almost anyone else, Samuel Adams recognized early that British policy threatened colonial liberty. He organized resistance, he wrote essays, he rallied public opinion. He helped form the Sons of Liberty and became one of the central figures behind colonial protest against taxation. To British officials, Adams was dangerous, not because he commanded armies, but because he could shape ideas. And in revolutions, ideas often come first. By the 1770s, these men, shaped by different experiences, had begun arriving at the same conclusion. Britain no longer viewed the colonies as partners. Washington saw it in military hierarchy. Franklin saw it in political humiliation. Jefferson saw it in philosophy. John Adams saw it in law. Hamilton saw it in opportunity. Samuel Adams saw it in power. Different roads, same destination. In 1776, those roads converged in Philadelphia. The Declaration of Independence was not simply a break from Britain. It was the product of years of thought, experience, and sacrifice. It was the culmination of lessons learned by men who had lived long before they became symbols. And what they began there would reshape the world. From 13 colonies on the edge of empire emerged a republic, unlike any the world had seen. Built not on monarchy, but on the belief that free people could govern themselves. It was an experiment, uncertain and fragile, yet it endured. Over the next 250 years, the United States would grow from a narrow Atlantic coastline into a continental nation. It would become the largest economy in human history, a military power without equal, and one of the most influential political forces the world has ever known. Its constitution would inspire governments across continents. Its principles of liberty, representative government, and individual rights would become aspirations for millions beyond its borders. In times of war, it would help shape the survival of the free world. In times of peace, it would become a symbol of opportunity, innovation, and self-government. For countless people across generations, America became more than a nation. It became an idea, a belief that freedom could endure, that ordinary people could shape their own future, that government existed not to rule over men, but to protect the rights they were born with. The men who built it were not perfect. They argued, failed, disagreed, and carried contradictions of their own. But perfection was never the requirement. What mattered was that when history demanded courage, they answered. 250 years later, their work remains unfinished, as all great nations are. But the republic they created still stands, stronger, larger, and more influential than anything they could have imagined. And perhaps that is the part of history we too often forget. History tends to leave that part out.